It was late September, just when the weather started turning cold, but not quite cold enough to keep people from the woods. I had always liked solo camping, ever since I was young. There was something about being alone in the wilderness that made me feel clear-headed. I never had a problem with it before. No bad encounters, no close calls. Just me, my tent, my gear, and the quiet hum of nature. That changed on my last trip. I had planned for a 4-day camping trip in a national forest about a 4-hour drive from home. It wasn't a tourist-heavy place. One of those forests where you might see a handful of hikers during the day, but at night you're truly alone. I liked that. I wanted that. I wanted to be away from everything. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, and started walking. I had a spot in mind about 8 miles in near a stream. It was off-trail, which meant more privacy. I had found it on an old map a few years back and had been there twice before. Nobody went that deep into the woods unless they had a reason to. Most casual hikers stayed near the designated trails, and hunters preferred areas with easier access. By the time I reached my spot, the sun was getting low. I set up camp quickly, tent, firewood, a quick check of the area. It was exactly how I remembered. The stream ran about 30 yards from my tent, clear and cold. There were no signs of recent campers, no fire pits or footprints. I was alone. The first night was quiet. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of animals. I had a small fire going, cooked some food, and went to bed early. No problems. The second day was when things started feeling off. I spent most of the morning hiking, exploring the area, gathering some extra firewood. Around midday, I got the strange feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a sound or a sight, just that unmistakable sensation of not being alone. I stopped, looked around. Nothing. The trees were still. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I listened for birds, squirrels, anything. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had spent too much time in the silence. But I couldn't shake it. I packed up and headed back to camp, keeping my head on a swivel the whole way. That night, I built a larger fire than usual. I told myself it was for warmth, but deep down, I wanted the extra light. I ate dinner, kept my knife close, and stayed up later than I normally would. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Not the small kind that animals break, but the kind that happens when something heavy steps on it. Came from behind my tent, deep in the trees. My first thought was a deer, but deer don't usually walk toward fire and human scent. They move away. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly turned in the direction of the noise. The trees were thick, my beam barely reaching beyond the first few rows of trunks. I scanned left, then right. Nothing. I stayed up most of the night listening. Every so often, I would hear something, a rustle, a step. It was never close, never direct. Just there. By morning, I was exhausted. I had planned for 4 days, but I told myself I'd cut it down to 3. I wasn't scared, I told myself. Just cautious. It was probably just an animal. Maybe another camper passing through. Maybe I was just tired. I spent most of the 3rd day close to camp. I didn't feel like wandering too far. Every so often, I would stop what I was doing and listen. Then I saw it. About 50 yards from my campsite, just beyond the tree line. A figure. It was a man. He was standing partially behind a tree, just barely visible. He wasn't moving, just watching. My stomach dropped. I stood there, frozen. My brain tried to make sense of it. Was he lost? A hunter? Another camper? I raised my hand, half a wave, half a signal. He didn't respond. I took a step forward. He stepped back, disappearing behind the tree. I waited, listened. Nothing. I didn't chase after him. I didn't call out. Something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I backed up toward my camp, keeping my eyes on the trees. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed up my gear, fast. I didn't even bother eating. I threw everything into my pack, stomped out my fire, and started walking. I had an 8-mile hike back to my truck. My pace was quick, steady. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps. The woods felt different now, less like a place of peace, more like a trap. About a mile in, I heard movement behind me. I stopped. Silence. I started walking again. A few minutes later, more movement. Closer. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept going, forcing myself not to run. Running would only make me tired, make me vulnerable. 3 miles left. The sun was starting to set. I cursed myself for not leaving earlier. Then I saw him again. He was farther up the trail, maybe 30 yards ahead. Standing there, not hiding this time. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face shadowed by the trees. I gripped my knife. He didn't move. I took a slow step back. He stepped forward. I turned and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My pack slammed against my back. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. I didn't care. The forest blurred past me. I kept expecting to hear him behind me, to feel hands grabbing at me. But there was nothing. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly collapsed. I scrambled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw my pack inside, jumped in, and locked the doors. For a few minutes, I just sat there, catching my breath, staring at the trailhead. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I started the engine and floored it, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. I haven't been back to that forest since. I still go camping, but never alone. Never that deep. And I always trust my gut. Because sometimes the feeling of being watched isn't just a feeling. Sometimes it's real. The last time I went winter camping, I told myself I'd never do it again. But then you forget the worst parts over time, like how cold it really is, how dark the woods get, how something as small as a broken stove can turn into a real problem. You remember the good things, the stillness, the beauty of snow-covered trees, the way the air feels clean in your lungs. You forget what it feels like to wake up and not be able to feel your feet. I should have stuck to my promise. It was mid-January, deep in the northern part of Minnesota, where the forests stretch for miles and the lakes freeze over thick enough to drive on. I had done trips like this before, always alone. I liked the challenge. It was a test against the elements, a way to see how well I could prepare, how smart I could be about my supplies. The plan was simple. 3 days. Hike into the woods, set up near a frozen lake, camp in a four-season tent, and then hike back. I had enough food, fuel, and gear to last longer than that if needed. I checked the forecast, cold, but nothing unexpected. The temperature was supposed to stay between 5 and 15 degrees, which wasn't bad for winter camping if you knew what you were doing. I started my hike late in the morning, the sun already struggling to cut through the thick clouds. Snow crunched under my boots, the only sound besides my steady breathing. I had my pack strapped tight, a sled behind me with extra gear. It was hard work, dragging it through the snow, but I made good time. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked on my map, a small clearing near a frozen lake, far from any roads or trails. I liked it that way. No people, no noise, just the trees and the cold. I set up my tent quickly before the sun dropped, my fingers already stiff from the temperature. I had a four-season tent, insulated pads, and a winter-rated sleeping bag. I built a small fire, enough to melt snow for water and warm my hands. The first night was quiet. I woke up once or twice, shifting in my sleeping bag, but nothing unusual. The only sound was the wind brushing against the tent, a soft rustling in the trees. The second day, I woke up to light snow falling. It was colder than expected, probably close to 0, but I layered up and got moving. I spent the day exploring the area, checking the ice on the lake. It was thick, no risk of falling through. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees, stronger than before. I made sure everything was secured, double-checking the stakes on my tent. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I realized I couldn't hear the wind anymore. The forest was silent. too silent. When you camp enough, you get used to natural sounds. Even in winter, the woods aren't completely quiet. There's always something. The creak of trees, the distant crack of ice shifting, the sound of snow falling from branches. But now there was nothing. I stayed still, listening. My breath felt too loud. Then I heard it. A single, heavy crunch in the snow. It wasn't close, maybe 50 feet from my tent. But it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, every muscle in my body tight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping the handle tight. My heart was hammering in my chest. Another step, and then nothing. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. The silence stretched, pressing in from all sides. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the first light of morning crept through the tent walls. When I finally unzipped the door and stepped outside, the air was sharp against my face. I looked around. Nothing at first. Just fresh snow, undisturbed except for my own footprints. Then I saw them. Footprints. Big ones. They came from the trees, stopped about 30 feet from my tent, then turned back. I crouched down, staring at them. They weren't boot prints. They weren't snowshoes. They were too wide, too deep. Bare feet in the snow. I felt my stomach twist. No one could be out here like that. Not in these temperatures. Not without gear. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led back into the trees, disappearing into the deeper snow. I couldn't see where they ended. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just the way the snow settled. Maybe an animal. But I packed up that day. I told myself I was cutting the trip short because the temperature was dropping, that it wasn't worth staying another night. But the truth was, I didn't want to find out who or what had been standing outside my tent in the middle of the night. I hiked out fast, barely stopping for breaks. The whole time I felt something behind me, not close, not visible, but there, watching. I reached my truck just before sunset, my breath fogging in the freezing air. When I turned the key, the engine struggled for a second before roaring to life. I sat there, hands on the wheel, staring into the darkening woods. Then I put it in gear and left. I've camped a lot of places. I've dealt with cold, hunger, injuries. But that trip was different. I still don't know what was out there watching me that night. And I don't want to. I haven't gone winter camping since. I don't know what I was thinking when I decided to camp in the old graveyard. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself, or maybe I just wanted to do something different. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just one night. I camped in worse places before. The graveyard wasn't famous or well known. It was just a small, overgrown patch of land outside a quiet town. No big stories, no legends, no ghost tales. Just a forgotten place where people had been buried a long time ago. It had been abandoned for years. The headstones were cracked, the grass was wild, and the dirt paths had faded into nothing. People had stopped coming here. Even the families of the dead had moved on. It wasn't hard to get there. A short drive down an empty road, a hike through a patch of woods, and then there it was. A quiet, empty graveyard with no visitors, no fresh flowers, no signs of life. The place felt forgotten, like time had erased it. The iron gate at the entrance was rusted, hanging off its hinges. The stone walls around the perimeter had crumbled in places, letting trees and vines creep in. It was clear that no one had cared for this place in years. I set up my tent near the edge, close to a few tombstones that had been swallowed by weeds. I wasn't scared. The place felt eerie, but I'd been in the woods alone plenty of times before. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves, but other than that, it was silent. No distant traffic, no voices, nothing. Just the sound of the breeze and the occasional creak of tree branches. I laid out my sleeping bag and lit a small fire with some dry wood I'd brought with me. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the graves. The names on the stones were barely readable. Time had worn them down to just faint letters and numbers. Some graves were nothing but lumps in the earth now, the markers missing or broken. As the night settled in, the temperature dropped. The air was damp, and every breath came out as a mist. The fire crackled, sending up little sparks, but beyond its light, the darkness felt heavy. I listened for sounds. Animals, the wind, anything, but the silence felt too thick. Something about it started to bother me. I was used to nature having a rhythm. Owls hooting, insects chirping, leaves rustling. But this place was still, too still. Then I heard something, a shift in the grass, a soft, slow movement, not the wind, something moving. I turned, looking past the fire's glow, but I didn't see anything, just the uneven ground and the dark shapes of headstones. I told myself it was just an animal, fox maybe, a raccoon, nothing to worry about. I went back to the fire, but the feeling stuck with me. The next time I heard it, it was closer. A step, a single footstep on the dry leaves. I stood up slowly. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond it was just blackness. I listened, waiting, barely breathing. Nothing. I stayed like that for a while, staring into the dark. Then, I sat back down, telling myself I was being paranoid. And then I heard it again. This time, behind me, I spun around so fast that I knocked over my water bottle. My heart was pounding. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping it over the area. The beam of light passed over crooked tombstones, dry grass, and open space. Nothing, but something had been there. I knew it. I stayed awake after that, listening. The fire burned lower, casting smaller shadows, but I didn't dare put it out. I kept my flashlight in my hand, sweeping it across the graveyard every few minutes. Then I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A shape low to the ground, near one of the older graves. It looked like a pile of leaves at first, but then it moved. Slow, deliberate, like someone crawling. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked off my flashlight, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. The fire was low, barely flickering now, and I felt completely exposed. I forced myself to listen. The sound of something dragging, the crunch of dead leaves. It was moving closer. I grabbed my knife, gripping it tight, even though I wasn't sure what I was planning to do. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just waited. The dragging stopped. Then came the breathing. It was close, just past the edge of the firelight. Deep, slow breaths, like someone trying to stay quiet. I wanted to run, but I knew better. I camped in the wild before. I knew that sometimes staying still was the only thing that kept you safe. I held my breath. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. I waited. Then, finally, I heard movement again, this time going the other way. A slow retreat, the sound fading into the distance. I stayed awake the whole night, gripping my knife, staring into the darkness. I didn't hear anything else after that. No more footsteps, no more breathing. But I didn't sleep. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my camp. Slow, deliberate steps. A pattern like someone had been walking around me in the dark. I didn't wait to think about it. I grabbed my gear, threw dirt over the fire, and left. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I will never camp in a graveyard again. I don't camp much anymore. When I was younger, I used to go out into the woods all the time, setting up camp in the quiet places where nobody else would go. It was peaceful, just the sound of the wind through the trees, the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I never thought much about those noises before. Animals, mostly. But after that night, I learned to pay more attention. To listen. To really listen. I was 29 when it happened. This was back in 2011, late October. The weather was getting cold, but not unbearable. It was the kind of crisp air that made your breath fog up in the morning but felt good in your lungs. I had a long weekend off from work, so I decided to head out alone. Just me, my gear, and miles of untouched land. I picked a spot I'd camped at before, deep in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky. It was about a 2-hour hike from the nearest dirt road, and I'd never seen another soul out there. Perfect. I wanted silence. I wanted to be away from everything. The first day went fine. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun went down, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind. That first night, I slept like a rock. The second night was different. It started with the woods going silent. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know what I mean. The natural sounds, crickets, owls, even the wind just stop. It's like something presses a mute button on the entire forest. That happened around dusk, just as I was finishing up my food. I felt it before I heard anything. The sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and the back of my neck went tight. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The fire crackled in front of me, and my tent was zipped up behind me. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. Then I heard footsteps. Not a deer, not a bear. Something walking deliberately just outside the glow of the fire. Slow, careful steps. Too heavy for a raccoon, too light for something large. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment I shined the light. I stood up, listening. The silence stretched out, thick and unnatural. I told myself it was an animal and sat back down. But I didn't feel right. It wasn't long before the sound came back. This time it was closer. Still deliberate, still careful. It was circling me. I felt my stomach tighten, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. I grabbed my knife, not that it would do much good against whatever was out there. I waited, barely breathing. Then, a sound I will never forget. My own voice came from the trees, just beyond the firelight. My own voice, calling out, low and stretched, like someone was trying to mimic me but didn't quite know how. It made my blood go cold. The fire crackled, and I forced myself to move, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. My hands were shaking. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was just hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. I stayed awake that night, gripping my knife, staring into the woods. The footsteps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far, but they never fully left. And every now and then, I'd hear that awful, stretched-out version of my voice. I should have left at first light. I don't know why I didn't. I guess I didn't want to believe what was happening. I packed up my camp slowly, my body stiff from a night without sleep. I kept my knife in my pocket and my flashlight in my hand. Even though the sun was up, I forced myself to eat something before the hike back, even though my stomach was tied in knots. That was when I noticed something was wrong with my gear. My backpack had been moved. Not much, just a few inches, but I knew exactly where I had left it the night before. The straps were undone like someone had gone through it. My water bottle was missing. That was the last straw. I threw everything together and started hiking back, moving fast but trying not to run. The whole way I felt it behind me, not right behind me, not close enough to see, but there, stalking me, following me. Then, maybe half a mile from my truck, I heard it again, my voice calling my name. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was ahead of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The woods were silent again. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. And then I saw it. A figure stepped out from behind a tree maybe 50 feet away. First, I thought it was a man, but it wasn't. It was wrong. It was tall, too tall, and thin in a way that didn't look natural. Its arms were long, its fingers too stretched, too sharp. And its face, it looked like me, but not me. Like something had tried to copy my face and had gotten close but not close enough. The eyes were wrong, too wide, too empty. The mouth was stretched too far, lips thin, curled like they didn't know how to sit naturally. And then it moved, not like a person, not like anything I've ever seen. It took a step toward me, slow and jerky, its head tilting to the side, the mouth twisting. And then it grinned. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life, lungs burning, legs screaming. I could hear it behind me, not running, just walking. Fast, but not running. Like it knew I couldn't get away. The truck came into view and I didn't slow down. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I slammed myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I floored it, gravel kicking up behind me as I tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving for hours. When I finally did, I sat there in silence, my hands still shaking on the wheel. My face was pale in the rearview mirror, my eyes hollow. I haven't been camping since. I still think about that thing, about the way it moved, the way it looked, the way it called my name in my own voice. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't think I ever will again. I was never the kind of guy to get scared easily. I grew up in Texas, spent my childhood hunting, fishing, and camping with my dad. The woods were like a second home to me, and I never felt out of place in them. But after what happened on a solo camping trip in northern Montana in the summer of 2013, I don't think I'll ever look at the wilderness the same way again. It started as a simple plan. I had just turned 32 and had a week off work. I figured I'd head up to a secluded campsite along the Missouri River, a spot I had visited once before with an old friend years ago. The place was remote, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest small town and then another few miles of rough dirt trails leading to a clearing by the water. There was no cell service, no rangers nearby, just miles of deep forest and the slow-moving river cutting through it. I had my gear packed, my old tent, sleeping bag, a .45 in my pack just in case of wildlife, and enough food and water to last me for a few days. I also brought my fishing rod, hoping to catch some fresh trout for dinner. It was supposed to be a peaceful, quiet trip, just me and nature, but things don't always go as planned. The drive up was uneventful. The dirt road was rougher than I remembered, with deep ruts from spring rains, but my truck handled it fine. When I finally pulled up to the clearing by the river, the spot was just as beautiful as I had remembered. Tall pines lining the shore, the water calm and deep, the air crisp and fresh. I set up my tent a little way from the water, close enough to hear the gentle flow but far enough back to stay dry. There were no other campers around, which was exactly what I wanted. That first day went by without a hitch. I fished for a while, caught a couple of decent-sized trout, cooked them over my small fire, and ate while watching the sun set over the trees. As the sky darkened, I threw a few more logs on the fire and leaned back against a fallen log, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional owl, the distant rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Normal sounds, nothing out of place. But around midnight, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't any specific noise that tipped me off, just a strange, creeping feeling that I was being watched. The fire had burned low by then, casting long shadows into the trees. I sat up, scanned the darkness, and listened. Nothing, just the river and the night sounds. I told myself I was just spooking myself for no reason, but I still grabbed my flashlight and did a slow scan of the trees. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a weirdly shaped tree or a shadow moving in the breeze. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. About 50 yards into the woods, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, there was something standing there. Not an animal, not a tree, something tall, human-shaped, standing perfectly still between the trunks. I felt my stomach tighten. I pointed my flashlight directly at it, but the beam only reached so far, and the thing, whatever it was, didn't move. It didn't make a sound. I didn't move either. I just sat there, my breath coming slow and quiet, my heart hammering against my ribs. After what felt like minutes, I blinked, and the shape was gone. I don't remember going into my tent that night, but I must have, because I woke up inside it the next morning. The fire was out, the air was cold, and everything seemed normal, almost like I had imagined the whole thing. By the time the sun was up, I had convinced myself I had just been seeing things in the dark. Maybe a dead tree at an odd angle, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I spent the morning fishing again, made some coffee, and shook off the weird feeling from the night before. I even laughed at myself a little, but then I noticed something strange. My cooler, which I had left near the fire pit, was open. I was sure I had latched it the night before, but now the lid was wide open, and 2 of my food containers were missing. No signs of an animal tearing through it, just gone. Neatly taken. My knife, which I had left next to my plate the night before, was also missing. A shiver ran down my spine. I started looking around the clearing more carefully. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The tracks were clear in the damp soil near my tent. They were human, barefoot, long, narrow, and deep enough to show that whoever had made them was heavy. They led from the tree line to my campfire, to my cooler, then back into the woods. I felt my throat tighten. My brain started running through possibilities. A lost hiker? A local messing with me? Some drifter hiding out in the woods? Whoever it was, they had been close. Real close. I packed up my gear within minutes. Every instinct in me screamed to get the hell out of there. But something about just running felt wrong. If someone was out there watching, they would know I was scared. And scared people make easy targets. So I forced myself to stay calm. I cleaned up my sight, packed everything into my truck, and left it looking like I wasn't planning on leaving yet. Then I took my rifle from the back seat and slung it over my shoulder. I decided to check the tree line. I followed the footprints about 20 yards into the trees before they faded into the underbrush. But as I stood there, scanning the ground, I noticed something else. A faint trail leading deeper into the woods. A narrow, overgrown path, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And something told me I needed to see where it went. I walked slowly, rifle in hand, stepping as quietly as I could. The trees grew denser, the light dimming as the canopy thickened overhead. I moved another 50 yards before I saw it. A small, makeshift shelter, barely more than a pile of branches and a tattered old tarp. And beside it, a pile of trash. Empty cans, torn clothing, and a plastic container that looked exactly like the ones missing from my cooler. Someone had been living out here, but the worst part wasn't the shelter. It was what was next to it. A pair of boots, and a hunting knife. My knife. I didn't stay to look any longer. I turned and walked, fast, but controlled, back toward my truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the clearing, my hands were shaking. I threw my gear into the truck, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. I never reported it. I figured there wasn't much to report. No crime had been committed, technically. Just someone living off-grid, too close to my camp for comfort. But the thought that stuck with me was this. Whoever it was, they had been there while I slept. Watching, close enough to take my knife, close enough to steal from my cooler. And I never even heard them. I still camp, but never alone. Never in places that isolated. And I always keep my rifle within reach. I had been driving for hours, the steady hum of the engine blending with the rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield. The sky had been overcast all day, and by the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading into the forest, dusk was already settling in. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. Just me, the woods, and a night away from everything. I like solitude. I had spent most of my life seeking out places where I wouldn't hear another voice, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures. This was one of those places, a remote patch of forest I had found on an old hiking map. There were no marked campsites, no ranger stations, just a forgotten dirt road that wound through miles of dense forest. By the time I found a clearing that looked suitable, the rain had picked up, tapping against the roof of my truck in steady bursts. I killed the engine, stepping out into the cool, damp air. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine, the scent thick in the humid air. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, grabbing my gear from the back of the truck. The ground was soft from the rain, but not muddy yet. I picked a spot a little ways from the road, where the trees were thinner and the ground looked dry enough for a tent. It took me longer than usual to set up. The rain made everything slick, and by the time I got the stakes driven into the earth, my fingers were numb from the cold. I sat in my small fold-out chair under the cover of a tarp, listening to the rain. My flashlight cast a weak glow on the damp grass, barely cutting through the darkness beyond. I hadn't seen another person for miles, and that was exactly how I liked it. The night settled in thick and heavy. The only sounds were the steady drip of rain from the trees and the occasional creak of the branches as the wind pushed through them. The fire I had tried to build was a failure, the wood too damp to catch. I resigned myself to a cold dinner, eating from a can while the darkness pressed in around me. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I had been camping alone since I was a teenager, and I knew how to handle myself. But something about that night felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, a weight in the air that made my skin prickle. I brushed it off. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. I sat for a long time, watching the rain bead against my tarp, letting the steady sound lull me into a daze. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap shut against the damp air. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me, more of a shift in the atmosphere. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the forest was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just stillness. I listened, my body tense. My tent was small, barely enough room to sit up, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not the heavy, clumsy steps of an animal, but careful, measured steps. I froze, barely breathing. The sound was close, moving slowly around my campsite. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight. The tent fabric was thin. If someone wanted to get inside, it wouldn't take much. The footsteps circled once, then stopped. Silence. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge. Then the sound started again, moving away this time, fading into the forest. I lay there for a long time, every muscle in my body tight. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. Morning came gray and cold, the rain still falling in a soft mist. I stepped out of my tent, stretching the stiffness from my limbs. The forest looked the same as it had the night before, silent, damp, empty. But I wasn't imagining things. There were footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my tent in a slow, deliberate path, then trailed off into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The prints weren't fresh. The rain had softened their edges, but they were there. Someone had been here. I packed up quickly, shoving my gear into my truck without care. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't going to risk it. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see something step out from the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty, wet forest stretching for miles. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I had been on the road for weeks, moving through France at my own pace, setting up camp wherever I found a good spot. It was the kind of trip I had always wanted to take. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I wasn't the type to stay in crowded campgrounds. I preferred the more secluded places, deep in the woods, where I wouldn't have to hear people talking or cars passing. This was sometime in the early 2000s. I was in my late 20s, still young enough to think I was invincible, but old enough to have some caution. I had driven my old van through the countryside, past small towns, stopping at random when I saw a place that looked good for the night. That day, I had been driving through a quiet stretch of road that cut through a forest. It was somewhere near the Dordogne region, not too far from a village, but far enough that I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. The forest was dense, the trees tall and packed together in a way that made the place feel untouched. There was a small dirt path leading off the road, barely visible, like it hadn't been used in years. That was exactly the kind of place I was looking for. I turned onto it and drove in until the trees closed around me, making the van feel like it was swallowed by the forest. It was late afternoon when I set up camp. The spot was perfect, silent except for the occasional sound of birds, the wind rustling through the trees. I set up my tent a little ways from the van, laid out my gear, and started a small fire. I sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet, eating a simple meal, watching the last light of the sun disappear behind the trees. The forest took on a different feeling at night. I had camped alone enough times to know that the dark could play tricks on you. Every little sound seemed louder, closer, but I had always been able to brush it off. That night was different. It started with a sound, something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. Animals move fast, unpredictable. This was steady, careful. I turned my head, trying to see through the darkness. My fire was small, not enough to push back the shadows beyond a few feet. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The trees stood still. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a fox, something harmless. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. I still couldn't see anything, but I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. I wasn't the kind of person to spook easily. I had camped alone plenty of times. I knew what the woods sounded like, but this felt wrong. Then I saw her. She was standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the weak light. A woman. She was thin, too thin, her skin pale like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her hair hung in messy strands around her face. She was wearing something dark, tattered. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long we stood like that, but I felt frozen, like moving would break some kind of rule I didn't understand. Finally, I managed to find my voice. I called out, not a greeting, not a question, just noise. Something to break the silence. She didn't react, didn't blink, just stood there staring. A chill ran down my spine. I had met weird people before while camping, but this was different. There was something off about her, something unnatural, not in a supernatural way, but in the way some people just feel wrong, like they don't fit into the world the way everyone else does. I didn't want to turn my back on her, but I also wasn't going to stand there all night staring at this woman. I took a step back toward my tent, keeping the flashlight on her. That's when she moved. Not toward me, not away. She just shifted, her body swaying slightly like she was trying to decide something. Then she tilted her head, slow, unnatural. That was enough for me. I grabbed my knife from my gear and held it where she could see. I wasn't looking for trouble, but I needed her to know I wasn't defenseless. She still didn't react. I made my way to the van, my heart pounding, never taking my eyes off her. When I reached it, I yanked the door open, climbed inside, and locked it. For a while, I just sat there, gripping my knife, watching. She didn't move. Minutes passed, then an hour. She stood in the same spot the whole time, barely shifting. Then, just as I was starting to wonder if she'd stand there all night, she turned. No rush, no sound. Just turned and walked slowly back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the knife in my lap, my eyes on the tree line, waiting for her to come back. She didn't. By morning, the woods looked normal again. Birds were chirping. The sun was filtering through the trees like nothing had happened. But I didn't waste time packing up. I threw my gear into the van, started the engine, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I told myself she was just some lost hiker, maybe someone living in the woods. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't it. There was something wrong with her, something I still can't explain. I never camped in that part of France again. I still think about her sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I wonder how many other people have seen her, and I wonder if next time she won't just stand there watching.